In 1853, the streets of New Orleans smelled of citrus, rot, and fear. The carriages clattered under thick, humid air. Riverboats moaned like dying animals in the harbor. And across the crowded wards of the city's makeshift hospitals, one sound never seemed to stop: the coughing. It was the summer when yellow fever climbed through the windows of mansions and shacks alike. The rich and the poor, the saved and the enslaved. It didn't matter. Some say 9,000 people died that season. Others say the number was higher. But in official records, one name is never mentioned, though dozens of lives could trace their survival back to her hands. This is the story they tried to forget. The story of the black nurse who cured a plague. You're watching The Forgotten File. They called her Biddy. Full name: Bridget Mason. She was born into slavery in Georgia, eventually brought west by Mormon pioneers and dropped in the underbelly of New Orleans sometime before 1850. Nobody knows why she stayed. Maybe it was the river. Maybe it was the quiet freedom she carved out in the spaces the law refused to look. By 1853, she worked quietly as a midwife, herbalist, and washerwoman in the district, a maze of courtyards behind cracked stucco walls, where black families lived stacked 3 stories. High like memories no one had the strength to paint over. To white authorities, Biddy Mason didn't exist. To everyone else, she was the one you called after the doctor gave up. Even on the hottest days, Biddy rose before dawn to boil herbs over coals. Yarrow, prickly ash, elderroot. She had learned them from her grandmother back in Georgia, who had learned them from hers. Knowledge passed down wrist to wrist, mouth to mouth. She made no formal medicine. Only teas and vinegars, rubs made from river clay, compresses soaked in strange, bitter oils. Her clients, sick children, pregnant women, dying men turned away from hospitals because they were black. She never charged much. Sometimes, she didn't charge anything at all. By late June, the fever had changed. It came faster, with blood from the mouth, yellow eyes, shrieking hallucinations. Those who caught it died screaming within 3 days. It came for everyone, even the rich. But when the disease hit the black districts the hardest, city officials simply stopped reporting from those neighborhoods. No funding, no documentation, no help. The was quarantined not with doctors, but with guards. They weren't saving anyone in those wards. They were containing the infection and burying the bodies quietly. That day, something changed. It wasn't just sickness. It was the look of something crafted, unnatural. She felt it in her bones. Biddy wrapped a cloth around her face. She grabbed her bag, homemade remedies and a flask of boiled olive leaf tonic, and followed the girl out the door. She saw it all: the makeshift coffin carts, the dumping grounds, the mass graves dug behind levees and labeled unrecorded. Whatever storm this was, no one else was willing to face it. And so she did. She didn't sleep for 3 days. She didn't leave the neighborhood for a week. People began whispering. The fever walks past her house. By the second week of July, stories trickled out. 15 cases healed under her roof. Locals said she made a rub from scorched orange rinds and wild mint boiled in turpentine. Others claimed she combined heat sweating with herbal smokes, causing patients to bleed out the demon virus. These weren't theories. They were miracles, disguised as old women's wisdom. On July 17th, Biddy was ordered to shut down her apothecary hut. Her name was not on any medical rolls. She had no training, no formal French schooling. Even though European doctors had started dying at 3 times the expected rate, the Board of Health refused to consider Negro folk cures. They called her work unsanitary. They called her surviving patients lucky deviations. They declared her home a vector site. By the end of that night, they had burned it to the ground. While she stood across the street holding a crying child, she didn't fight. She just started again. This time underground. What no one knew at the time was that Biddy had started recording everything. She recorded symptoms, herbal doses, survival timelines. She marked how each blend worked on different ages, how many hours passed before fever broke. Her journal, a converted travel Bible sewn with extra pages, was never meant for glory. It was meant to preserve what no one else wanted to know. But then something happened. One of the city's white physicians, a young assistant working at a segregated hospice near Canal Street, began asking questions. Quietly, kindly. He wanted to know how she'd treated 22 people. When he'd buried all but 5 of his, the young doctor's name was Thomas Blake. Forgotten now, save for one letter tucked in the archives of Tulane Medical School. In it, he writes, "She has no license, no title. But I watched dying men walk within a day of her tending. If I speak her name, I am warned I may lose my station. If I stay silent, then God help all of us." He sent that letter on September 3rd, 1853. It was never answered. Biddy lived. The epidemic eventually ended. The city declared itself victorious, but the journals she wrote never published. The letter Thomas sent, filed under uncorroborated testimonial, and the survivors who credited Biddy, most couldn't read. They had no voice, but they remembered, and so do we. This is the Forgotten File. The city celebrated too early. When the weather cooled in late August, the fever slowed. Doctors claimed victory. Officials issued statements. Carriages returned to the boulevards. But in secret, the root of the sickness still bloomed. Quiet, withheld, and deeply buried. And Biddy Mason? She now worked in silence, underground again. This time not just because she was black, but because she had seen too much and asked the one question no one else dared. What if this wasn't natural? The fever wasn't acting like it had before. At first it was classic yellowjack, vomiting, jaundice, internal bleeding. But soon, Biddy saw patterns that didn't make sense. Some patients developed symptoms within hours, not days. Their bleeding came through the skin itself. Their lungs stopped before the liver ever showed signs of decay. It spread faster in certain neighborhoods, but skipped over others, even those also swamped by mosquitoes. Poor died quickest, especially the black poor. Others recovered almost untouched, and a few seemed somehow completely immune. Biddy had questions. Too many for someone they'd already tried to erase. One night, while on her way toward the river, Biddy recognized the voice of Dr. William Cutter, a senior physician assigned to the city's wealthier districts and a known associate of the quarantine zone decisions. She slipped behind his cart, pretending to gather wood. Inside, among his tools, she saw glass bottles marked with numbers and tags written in French. One was labeled, Lot 76, EXP, CMS only. She didn't know what CMS meant, but she'd seen nursing bottles before. These weren't for healing, they were for testing. Thomas Blake had been watching too. He'd noticed something buried in the medical reports. Irregular listings of trial patients, many of whom were black residents forcibly relocated during the worst days of the epidemic. Many had no family. Many were illiterate. All had died. Thomas kept patient records and began circling names. "I think there's something going on at Charity Hospital, something they don't want in the ledgers." He'd mentioned it to another doctor. The next day, his access to the internal pharmacy was revoked. It was September 12, 1853. The record lists it as the day the fever broke in New Orleans. But in her journal, Biddy marked it differently. "The night I saw the bodies, they snuck into the hospital's lower level, the storage room used for plague victims too quickly buried for ceremony. What they found were 14 unlisted corpses, each tagged but not with names, with serial numbers. Burned scars on the back of the necks, deep subcutaneous bleeding, cuts on the arms, surgical incisions stitched with twine, not victims of disease, victims of experiment." Biddy didn't just discover a cover-up. She stumbled onto one of the earliest and most hidden cases of involuntary medical experimentation in American history, predating Tuskegee, predating eugenics laws in the heart of the antebellum South. Black patients were being intentionally infected and tested, possibly with altered virus strains, herbal challenges, or rudimentary vaccines. When test subjects died, they were dumped, unmarked. When they survived, they were tracked. Biddy's records may have been the only documentation to survive. She knew she had no power. Not in law, not in medicine, not in skin. But she had something else, a community that remembered. By early October, whispers of what she'd seen traveled through the city's black districts. And suddenly, people stopped trusting free clinics. They returned to the healers, to herbs in hands and heat, PD, and survival rates surged, even faster than in white wards. It wasn't magic, it was protection. 1 week later, Biddy was approached in the marketplace by a man with a badge, a sanitary inspector. Though he had no identification, he asked what she treated patients with, who she saw, what she wrote. He offered to buy her notes for national use. She refused. That night, her second home burned too. And still, she did not stop. As the city declared recovery and moved on to rebuilding, Biddy kept writing. By November, she estimated 87 survivors had come through her hands directly. None had paid her. None had reported her. She didn't want a statue or a library. She wanted people to live. But that made her dangerous. Thomas Blake tried one last time. He submitted a formal statement to the Louisiana Medical Journal, noting community-aided recoveries among underserved populations attributed to an unlicensed midwife. The article was rejected, he was told. Publishing would embolden superstition and encourage colored interference with official medicine. Weeks later, he left New Orleans. His name disappears from records after 1854. Some say he fled. Others say he talked once too loud. She understood the lesson. The city didn't care about credit. It cared about control. If something worked and they didn't find it first, they would unfind it. So Biddy changed her mission, not just to treat people, but to teach people to remember. Because truth couldn't survive on paper in her world. It had to survive in people. She lived 2 more decades and never published a single word. Her journal passed quietly through hands too cautious to let it die. No books were written until long after her death. No doctors quoted her recipes. Instead, her cures were rediscovered under new names, stamped by European patents, tested again in clean labs, and sold back to the world. But ask anyone in the old districts of New Orleans, and they still know her name. Why? Because truth lives longest, where paper won't. This is the forgotten file. There is no statue, no hospital bearing her name, no date on the calendar to honor what she did. In the city where thousands cried out during an epidemic, the woman who answered, alone, has been forgotten. Not because her work wasn't real, but because her work was inconvenient. When you heal without permission, when you fight plague without paper credentials, history doesn't reward you, it buries you. It wouldn't be until almost 170 years later that Biddy's name would appear in academic circles. And even then, only in the margin of an unpublished research paper presented in an underfunded discrete Black Medical History Conference in Mississippi. The speaker, Dr. Alice Duval, a medical anthropologist who, while researching smallpox outbreaks in post-Civil War Louisiana, stumbled on a footnote in a 1920s oral history collection. There was a woman we called Miss Biddy, didn't wear no apron, kept roots in her coat. Them what died fast, she never touched. Them she touched. Most of them walked out again. Dr. Duval wanted to know who Miss Biddy was, and what she found would unlock one of New Orleans' quietest conspiracies. Someone preserved the journal, not all of it. Most pages were burned, water-stained, rewritten again and again in different hands. Names were changed, ratios scribbled in code. But the key markers remained. The fever protocols, the symptom logs, the plant recipes, the survival stats. And at the top of each entry, a hand-drawn candle. Sometimes the only clue that this wasn't mysticism, but precise clinical recording from a woman who had no clinic. It wasn't superstition, it was science, just not the kind the textbooks wanted. The deeper Dr. Duval looked, the more disturbing the puzzle became. In buried archives of the New Orleans Board of Health, she found a single receipt, dated September 19, 1853, signed by Dr. W. Cutter, payment for relocation and disposal of non-compliant bodies. The attached invoice? Specimens 11 to 23, Lot 76, CMS classification for B. It was the same label Biddy had seen scratched into the bottles weeks before. CMS Cutter, Lot 76. Experimentation. Biddy hadn't imagined it. She had witnessed black bodies being used as unconsenting medical trials. At the height of the outbreak, a secret pilot program run by the Louisiana Medical Association was quietly targeting non-citizen patients and the colored poor. The terminology was vague, bureaucratic. What it really meant was slaves, freedmen, unregistered black families. They were reported as trial subjects, but they weren't told. They weren't counted when they died. It was illegal even by 1853 standards. The reason it disappeared from public knowledge is because a few powerful people understood exactly how fragile their medical authority was, and how dangerous a healer like Biddy really was. It wouldn't publish her findings. Not in mainstream journals. Not in public forums. Too speculative, they said. Too anecdotal. There's no solid proof of Bridget Mason's medical background or authority. Ironically, that was the point. She never had the power to create that proof. She was denied the ink, the paper, the license, the time. All she had were her hands, the memories she left stitched inside the people she saved. After the epidemic, Biddy moved quietly west. Some traced her name to California, where another woman named Biddy Mason, also a freed woman and a nurse, founded a clinic in Los Angeles. It's unknown if they were the same person, or if someone changed her name again. But by reconstruction, her trail had vanished. Vanished, until a dusty Bible turned up in an abandoned church in Iten-Jobai-Loshisen. Inside, notes matched the language of the surviving fragments Dr. Duval studied. Clearer, more precise, almost like a final draft. The back of the book, written in pressed ink. They made me burn the first one, so I wrote 2 more. That Bible, now stored in a restricted archive, contains the earliest known herbal treatment protocols for yellow fever in the American South, written from memory, by a woman history refused to see. Her work has since been verified, not just by anthropology, but by pharmacology. Modern labs confirm that some of her treatments match contemporary understandings of fever management, digestive virus inhibition, and anti-inflammatory symptom reduction. Or in other words, she knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't need a lab to do it. Today, they're starting to remember her. Not in textbooks, not in museum wings, but in whispered classes, community gardens. Stations named after nothing but a story. Truth passed between hands, between healers, between survivors. That's how you outlive erasure. So why was she forgotten? Because in 1853, healing wasn't just about saving lives. It was about who had the right to be the savior. And Biddy Mason didn't ask for that right. She simply took care of her people when no one else would, and paid the price for daring to succeed. But her name still moves through the roots, through the breath of the cured, through the pages she hid in, the ones she never got to write. And now her voice has been heard again. This is the forgotten file. If her story moved you, don't let it vanish again. Comment her name, share her legacy. Subscribe for more stories that history tried to erase, but we remember.